Alright, so the point of this video is to demonstrate a way to track abstraction in Obsidian. Now the reason why you would want to do something like this is if you're trying to break down or if you're trying to design something that's going to be really complicated, like a complex system. Say you're trying to build like a program that has several layers of abstraction, and you're not just wanting to track those layers of abstraction, but you're also wanting to describe the functions of certain parts within that category or within that layer of abstraction. Uh, Obsidian, this is the app that I'm using to demonstrate this. It's a free app. I'm using the canvas mode, and this is what I'll be using to show a possible way that you could use this if you're wanting to take notes or if you're wanting to design something. So here is an example that I have created. We're essentially saying here that A is comprised of three B's. So 1A equals 3B. And so what we're doing is we're breaking A down, where A is a higher level of abstraction. We're more concrete in this layer right here because we've broken it down into more specific parts. And so here is my B example where I have made essentially the same thing, but B is comprised of three C's. And so this is what's so cool about Obsidian is that if I were to want to reference the structure of that layer of abstraction or the breaking down of that layer, I can simply drag the file into its place in the layer that it's being broken down in, and now I can click on it and it will take me right to that layer right here. Now this might seem like pretty straightforward, pretty simple, but this is a pretty simple way of showing it. The reason why this is so beneficial is because you isolate parts of something and break it down even further instead of being redundant. So for instance, if I wanted to break this down further within just a two-dimensional flowchart like we have here, then I would have to put 9 C's right here, which is a bit redundant, right? Because I already know that that a B is comprised of 3 C's. So I can just store that information in this node, and then I can go to that node and see what B's are comprised of. So essentially, we're able to gain multiple perspectives by adding a dimension to our flowcharts. And so I can show a real-world example of this, right? I have a car. Well, in order for me to begin to understand what the object of a car is, I have to break it down further into the parts of a car. And so there are very general parts of a car, and there are very specific parts of a car. There are parts of a car that belong to parts of a car. Essentially, you can divide things infinitely. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do that with a car because eventually you just get atoms, and that's not very useful. So at some point you would stop once you've reached the end of the framework you're trying to explore. But obviously, if I were to list every car part in this entire hierarchy, it would be impossible. I mean, these are not all of the car parts of these car parts. So if we break down a car, we know that there's a fuel system, an electrical system, we know there's an engine, right? But those can be divided into a ton of other parts, right? We know that an engine has pistons, we know it has an engine block, a crankshaft, cylinder head, we know it has all of those things, right? Same thing with a fuel system and electrical system. We know that there are components that are a part of other components. And so this is where we encounter more of the limits of a two-dimensional flowchart that is organized in this way. For instance, spark plugs, they're not just part of the electrical system, but they're also a part of the engine. But it's very difficult to demonstrate that particular thing because although it still belongs in the same level of abstraction, because it's still going to be below this layer. That first of all doesn't mean it has to only belong underneath that level of abstraction because there might be a relationship that this object has with a different layer of abstraction. But also, again, it would be redundant to just have to put Sparkplug under every single one in the same flowchart You're still going to have to put it under the same one in every single individual flowchart that you build for each object, but you're doing so in a way that describes its function within that structure. So it's pretty straightforward with objects, but what about subjects, right? So if we have something non-material, we can still break down something that's non-material. So what we can use for an example is personality models, such as the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which might not, on a side note, I know that's not necessarily the most scientific personality tool, but it really provides me an intuitive way of demonstrating the way to build notes with this system. So essentially, in MBTI, you have personality, and within this framework, you break it down into judging and perceiving. Okay, so now there is one dimension of personality. We have the totality of personality. We've broken it down, and we are now in a more specific layer of abstraction. But judging can be brought down into thinking and feeling, and perceiving can be broken down into sensing and intuition. But what's also awesome about this is that these objects are dichotomous, they are dualities. So I can use arrows to describe that relationship all the way down the hierarchy. So it might be kind of crudely made here, but you can see that this is a breakdown of essentially all of the cognitive functions in MBTI, right? You have the 8 cognitive functions down here, essentially. But if you were wanting to do anything with those, you couldn't, because you have such a rigid structure here. So what I could do instead is describe the function of judging with its own structure, and I will be able to specify further because I'm isolating judgment. So let me go ahead and put this as personality. Am I even recording right now? Okay, yeah, I am. Good. And what we could do now is we could create a new canvas for judging. And we can say that there's judging here, and we could say that there is an extroversion of judging, and an introversion of judging. You can use feeling as a judgment, both in an introverted direction and an extroverted direction. And you can do the same thing with thinking. So here we have a much more accurate description of what judging is, and we're able to pack this in within the totality of the framework. So if I were to go to judging right here, I could just drag the structure of judging in, and even if I were to expand this a little bit, you'd even be able to see the structure of that. So if I wanted to do the same thing with perceiving, I could. So here I have built the structure of perceiving, or at least a structure of perceiving that you can use to sort of maybe more intuitively understand the system of MBTI. So I could put this here, and I could go perceiving, and then in personality I can drag and drop perceiving in, and suddenly we have that duality more accurately described. And if we really wanted to, we kind of have already accurately described these without having to use just one dimension of abstraction. So what we're able to actually do completely here is delete these bottom layers. They're absolutely redundant. And so what we get is not only a more accurate structure, but a way to view the layers of abstraction one perspective at a time. And this is a much more interactive way to go about mapping out your knowledge. Now, of course, on the surface, this is a very simplistic framework. All we've really managed to do is show the relationships between items in a given framework. But what we're also able to do is drag and drop files and notes into the canvas mode to further uh, reference the things that we know. So for instance here, if I wanted to write a document about introverted feeling, I could say introverted feeling is so cool and so awesome on Chief Keef himself. So I have this string of information. Introverted feeling is so cool and so awesome on Chief Keef himself, okay? I want to store this information. I want to give context to this information. So the way that I would do that is I could go into I could go into my personality framework. I could click on the judging framework, and then I could go to the node that would specifically be introverted feeling, and I could drag and drop the notes of that into that node so that I can reference those notes. And by referencing those notes, I will be taken to an explanation of what that node does, or what it is, or what it's made of. And so this is why Obsidian is such a cool note-taking app, is because there is so much fluidity and organizing that you can do with your notes, especially if you're someone that just takes notes on a lot of things, or if you end up writing a lot of things, or if you're someone who's trying to get a holistic view of something that you're learning. This is absolutely the way to do it in the long term. And so what this really allows us to do is to build a very nuanced framework to view anything that we're studying through, whether it be an actual object like a car, or it's a subject like personality or philosophy or anything that you're studying. You can easily go in and be able to reference everything that you know and give it context by placing it in some sort of location. Like if you're really wanting to, say you're like a computer science student and you're having a hard time understanding how just a bunch of ones and zeros turn into the entire uh, computer screen that you're looking at. Well, there are so many, there's layers upon layers of abstraction that compile into the totality that is your computer. It's incredibly difficult to track all of those things and especially get an intuitive understanding of those things. Because, of course, I could know that my computer runs with states that are on and off, right, because of electricity. But and that's intuitive to me because I've turned on my computer before and I've seen what it does. But it's not intuitive to me exactly how that happens. So this system is essentially a map or a library of some sorts. It allows you to demonstrate the relationships between subjects within subjects, or subjects within objects, or objects within subjects. And it allows you to break those down even further until you can eventually get to a point where you are locating your notes. You are finding where your information that you have learned, where exactly and precisely it is relevant.